We are Zooming. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm really excited to get into this conversation about environmental justice and specifically environmental justice in Raleigh. I'm going to briefly introduce myself and let each of the speakers in this conversation introduce themselves as well. And then we're going to get into some juice about environmental justice. So I am Stacia Turner. I'm a project manager with the Conservation Funds Parks with Purpose project. We're working on a park project in Southeast Raleigh called the Bailey Gateway Park Project. And since all of our Parks with Purpose projects are in Black and Brown urban communities, environmental justice is sort of at the core of the work that we do and that I do. And this issue is very close to my personal heart and work that I've been doing for quite a while. And so I really wanted to take some time to have a conversation specific to Raleigh. I think that a lot of the viewers will find that the information they hear about Raleigh and the experiences in Raleigh are similar to their own city. So it's a unique experience, but also one that I think has trends in other places. So with that, I'll let the speakers introduce themselves. How about we start first with Tatiana?
Hello, my name is Tatiana Height, and I am the program director of Partners for Environmental Justice. I'm still new in this role. It's been a little over 2 months now. But yeah, I'm happy to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being a part of it. Ms. Ajuba.
Yes. Greetings to all. My name is Ajuba Joy, and I am a native New Yorker, but I live in Raleigh and have lived in Raleigh for many, many years. I'm a teacher. I work at a charter school here in Raleigh, and I love it very much. And I moved into this community, I guess around 1986. And so I'm concerned about things that I've seen and things that are happening in our community. So that's who I am.
Thank you for that. And when you say this community, you're speaking specifically about Rochester Heights?
Rochester Heights, in the subdivision in which I live. Historic.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Reverend Jermon?
Thank you, Stacia. Jermon Taylor, rector of St. Ambrose Episcopal Church in the Rochester Heights community in Southeast Raleigh, where I've been for 8 years. I currently sit on the Stormwater Management Advisory Commission, which the acronym is SMAC. I think that's a great acronym. And we advised Raleigh employees around stormwater and stormwater management. And I think it's particularly important that I am a part of this because I see a church or pastor a church that is experiencing flooding in a neighborhood that has historically experienced flooding.
Thank you. And Amin, last but not least.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Amin Davis. I am the interim chairperson of Partners for Environmental Justice. So Tatiana and I work together. I'll tell you a little bit. PEJ is essentially a nonprofit organization that was created back in the mid-1990s and birthed out of St. Ambrose Episcopal Church that Reverend Taylor just spoke about to address flooding, dumping, and just overall neglect or perceived neglect from the city of Raleigh. I'm looking forward to this discussion, and thank you, Stacia, for organizing and coordinating this.
Thank you all for being here. So yeah, I really want this to be a free-flowing discussion. So Some of the questions might be specifically pertinent to a particular person on the call, but I want each of you to feel free to sort of respond to any of the questions that feel relevant to you, but also not pressured to answer any of them. So the first question I really wanted to start with is breaking down what environmental justice means. I think in general, we hear a lot of buzzwords with social media culture in general, and it can really distance us from what these concepts actually mean in action on the ground. So I'd love to hear from each of you, just like, what does environmental justice mean? What does it mean? What does it look like to you and your experiences of what that term means?
I'll start. When I think of environmental justice, I think of justice within the environment of where people reside or where they work, but I think basically where they live makes a big difference in terms of how they see things. And so what comes to mind is that things are allowed to be equitable. Sometimes equal is not always what's necessary. It needs to be equitable. And in my community, there are lots of issues that definitely are not equal, but they're also not equitable. People are not always getting what we need.
That was great, thanks.
I guess I'll say, I first want to say that I am not an environmental justice practitioner or professional. And in many ways, I feel as though I'm just kind of at the beginning stages of learning how to effectively serve in this important work. But I will say, I guess I thought of a definition in my mind that environmental justice is a grassroots collaboration of stakeholders who effectively work together to bring awareness, resources, and restorative actions to reverse environmental conditions that are having adverse impacts on their community. So, and then kind of on the more extreme end, we know that environmental justice generally affects communities of color more than the overall population. So I guess on the extreme end, I've also begun to see environmental justice as being similar to environmental racism after hearing that term used by a community faith leader in Southeast Raleigh that I have a lot of respect for. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, I love to hear these different perspectives.
When I think about environmental justice, I look at it through the lens of being a Christian, one who leads a faith community. So in a Christian context, justice is about right relationship, which is different from how the laws look at justice, which is more about retribution or remuneration. And so when I think about environmental justice, we traditionally think about the four categories of sin. And when we think about sin, it's not so much what you do or don't do, but rather your relationship to something else. And so Christians talk about sin or right relationship with God, with other human beings, with ourselves. We don't often love and treat ourselves with kindness, and against the environment. And so environmental justice is really looking at the sin that human beings have done against the environment and what we can do to bring about right relationship, restoration. And so an area where I serve, Rochester Heights, was a dumping ground for now 133 years. We used to say for 70 years until the dumping of the federal building until June of 2020. So 133 years of continuous dumping of raw sewage in Rochester Heights, the continuous dumping of garbage, that's sin. And so human beings have sinned against the environment. And so what is right relationship? And so environmental justice is about right relationship. And then when we look at what Professor Kimberly Crenshaw talks about the intersectionality of race and environment, then we get the term environmental racism. And so Rochester Heights really is at the intersection of those two, inequities as it relates to race, inequities as it relates to environment. And so how can I, as a human, as a person who cares about the environment, work toward the restoration of the environment? And so to me, environmental justice is about environmental restoration and right relationship.
Right on, right on.
Wow.
I feel like I'm in the pews right now receiving a word. This is supposed to be Zoom.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah, I almost want to just not say anything to follow that. But for me, when I describe what environmental justice means, I like to describe it as the intersection or the nexus between the environmental movement and the civil rights movement. The traditional environmental movement was really centered on plants, kind of the biome, animals, wildlife, and that kind of thing. And I think an unfortunate result of that is that kind of people were really left out of that, outside of this discussion about what people have done to exacerbate or cause environmental problems, but not so much in a conversation about how marginalized people are impacted by the environment in disproportionate ways, as has kind of already been mentioned. So it's really not only about the health of the environment and natural resources and that kind of thing, but also the civil rights that have come as a result of that. So, you know, things like toxic waste dumping in marginalized communities and taking lands away from indigenous people and not having access to the same kind of environmental benefits that affluent communities have. So it's not just a natural resource or water resource issue, but it's also, there's human dimensions of that. And so I think that's just really important. I like to say that it's kind of the intersection between those two issues where the two kind of came together and had a baby. So and I think too, in terms of like, what does environmental justice look like? There's these 17 principles of environmental justice that came out of this summit that happened back in the 90s. So I would encourage people to look up the 17 principles of environmental justice. It talks about like, what are the demands? What is an environmentally just world looks like? You know, it's an intergenerational movement and things like that. So I would direct people to that.
And thanks for bringing that up, Tatiana. I'll put a link to that document in the show notes for this recording, just so people have that as a reference. And I'm going to be a non-traditional facilitator and add my perspective also into the mix. And I just want to add, I mean, we've had, I think, a rich wealth of answers to this question. But one additional factor that I would like to add, as a person who's like been working on park projects for the past couple of years, when I think about environmental justice, I really think about getting back to some of what Tatiana and Reverend Germain said about right relationship. For me, environmental justice looks like right relationship between humans and the environment, and particularly looking at equitable access. So in all the ways that we mean that, to a healthy, livable environment. So whether that be feeling like you feel safe in the environment where you live, your neighborhood, your park, whether you feel safe going to a national park, whether it's that you have clean drinking water that's not lead contaminated. You know, I think there's a lot of ways that we can look at what environment means and what justice means, but to me, it's making sure that there's equitable relationship and management between natural resources across people. I think that's what environmental justice means to me. And so my follow-up question, and this is slightly directed towards Reverend Germain, but I'd love to hear everyone's perspective about this, especially as Tatiana brought in the the intersections between environment and the civil rights movement and how environmental justice is that. What has the role been and what is the role today of faith-based organizations and institutions in the environmental justice movement? Why is it important and what's their role?
I can speak about St. Ambrose specifically. As I mentioned, we are in Rochester Heights. St. Ambrose is located in Rochester Heights that has a history of flooding because of environmental neglect. And so in the mid-90s, one of our church leaders, a woman, went to the rector at that time, Father Arthur Calloway, and said, "I'm tired of my basement flooding. What are you going to do about it?" And so he approached Dr. Norman Camp, longtime environmentalist in Raleigh, and that was the genesis of what began as Episcopalians for Environmental Justice, partnering with another church in Fuquay, Verena. We quickly learned that the church alone cannot do this effort, that we must partner with other entities, including government. And so that name was changed to Partners for Environmental Justice. We removed the Episcopal denominational name, and that name exists today, PEJ, Partners for Environmental Justice. And so you have the church being the genesis of that specific movement as it relates to Raleigh. And out of that grew an educational center. Out of that grew a $1 million bond to help restore the Walnut Creek wetland area, turn it from a 5-acre center into a 50-acre park. And so that's a historical context. But to even go back a little bit farther in time, when we think about the plight of those of African descent on these shores, there has always been a close connection to nature. Part of that is that for those enslaved Africans brought here on ships, forced into chattel slavery, our relationship was to the land, as those who farmed the land, of those who grew crops. It is not happenstance that several places in this country thrive historically because of the works of those formerly enslaved Africans. You go to South Carolina, they grow rice. It's no question that those rice growers came from Ghana, where they grew rice and were great rice growers. When you look at the front of the world, which is in the western part of North Carolina, those woodworkers, again, came from the Akan people in West Africa, people who knew trees, who knew wood, and knew how to craft. And so our relationship to the environment has always been close. There is this embodiment that Black people carry as a part of our spirit. And so environmental justice is just the evolution of that. Even though we're in an industrialized society, is baked into our DNA, this love for the creator, the creation, and for earth. I think particularly the Black church has been poised and has responded to environmental injustice because the church is where Black people are. And Black people have been forced and have found themselves in areas where they have been oppressed by the dominating culture and forced into undesirable spaces. That's why Rochester Heights exists. It was an undesirable space. It's a desirable space now, so we see gentrification, but in 1957 it was an undesirable space. So the church's proximity to Black people who have been forced into oppressed areas means that the Black church has responded to the needs of Black people and thereby responded to the needs of the environment, because the environment is where we serve and where we find ourselves.
That was a beautiful response.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, following up, I feel kind of inadequate to follow up behind that, but I'll just say from my perspective in terms of churches and faith-based organizations, obviously they've played important roles in social justice movements. And as Reverend Taylor said, they've been the pillar institution of Black communities, since the Reconstruction period, and maybe before that if they gathered in smaller groups. I can just speak to the two environmental justice movements that I'm aware of. I know there are many, but one of them, Tatiana mentioned it earlier regarding toxic landfill waste. Back in March, I I got to meet a gentleman named Bill Kearney, who was involved with the PCB toxic landfill protest back in the 80s in Warren County. And he mentioned that, back with that movement, the churches were the primary grassroots organizations involved with the protest. And that movement, some believe, is the beginning of the modern environmental justice movement, although I'm sure it can be traced back, as Reverend Taylor mentioned. And secondly, regarding PEJ, back in the mid-1990s, I won't rehash the history because we've already talked about it, but I was fortunate to spend some time around Dr. Norman Camp, and definitely, and particularly in his later years, he would often tell the story about how Father Calloway, who Reverend Taylor mentioned, who was a pastor at St. Ambrose at that time, told him to, his line, Dr. Camp's line is to, told him to take this floundering group that was formerly known as Episcopalians for Environmental Justice and do something with it. And, I think even the fact that the Dr. Norman and Betty Camp Education Center at Walnut Creek Wetland Park stands as a testament that he and the partners and the group did do something with what they were tasked to do. And I think now, Tatiana, myself, and our current board, who is made up of many members who were involved back in the 90s and early 2000s, are still committed to that, although, things have shifted in terms of our priorities. But in general, we want to advocate for both the natural and the human communities around the Walnut Creek wetlands.
Thank you.
I don't know if there's a whole lot more that needs to be said, but I just want to say something about Dr. Camp and all of you who have ever heard him speak. When we talk about doing work, he would always say, don't agonize, organize. And, when I think of St. Ambrose and the spiritual aspects of it, this is where the people were, many of the people were. And people who understood they were an organization. They were coming, they talked about things, and it was on a regular basis. And so it was a natural fit with the energy of Dr. Camp, Father Calloway, and now Father Jamon. It's a continuation of being with the people, working with the people, encouraging the people to do what needs to be done within this environment that we're living in. And so, we're not agonizing, we're organizing, and we are, stepping up to the plate. And you are some beautiful folks. I'm just sitting here looking at these people, and I'm really happy that we are able to have this conversation because I think it's important that we do. And so that's what comes to my mind when I think of the religious aspect and the environmental aspect, that these are people who are organized, care about the community, and also the spiritual aspect of things. My little 2 cents about this virus, as it's been said, it's come from on high. Everybody's been affected by it. No one is, even the creatures. And right now I'm sitting in a place where normally you probably hear a lot of traffic, because 40 is not far from here. It's just as quiet as it can be. So, this time is a real time for us to do soul searching, as well as doing what we need to do for our environment.
This was great. Thank you, guys. You have anything you want to add, Tatiana?
Not particularly. I don't think I have to
Okay.
add to that.
No pressure.
Yeah. I think
Pressure later on.
Sorry now?
Pressure later on.
Don't pressure me later on either. But I think definitely it's still going on today from the roots. I'll agree with that. One of the organizations that I've been involved with since I moved to North Carolina has quarterly meetings, and they're typically in churches. And I think about some of the leaders who speak at different events, like Reverend Barber, for example, is a huge environmental justice activist and advocate, and spoke at the climate reality leadership training in Atlanta, and does a lot of that work. So I think it's definitely something that can't be ignored, but it's not much I can add to what's already been said besides that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I asked this question also, not just to queue up something for Reverend Jamon personally, although we all love to hear him speak. But because I think that sometimes there is a misnarrative about how faith-based institutions, particularly the Episcopalian Church in America, what kind of a role churches and Black churches have played in the environmental justice movement in America, and how that legacy lives on today, like we see in the example of Reverend Jamon and St. Ambrose. I wanted to highlight that because it's important to sort of, I think, shed light on that kind of trajectory of justice and faith-based institutions, spirituality, and healing ourselves through healing the environment, but also to underscore that, you know, I think there's a lot of missed opportunities still today from my perspective in terms of churches, and particularly Black churches, sort of talking about the ways in which we can do just that, sort of work on our relationship with ourselves and our Creator and our spirituality through this kind of aspect of showing up for ourselves and advocating for equitable environment. So I loved hearing what you all had to say, and glad that we could shed some light on that history in Raleigh and in America and the environmental justice movement in general. So this question, I really wanted to kind of dig into how each of you got into environmental justice activism in whatever way you see yourself as an activist. And I just want to prime that question with saying that, like, you know, I think anyone who cares about their community and the environment in whatever sense that means to you is an environmental justice activist and advocate. So don't feel like there's any kind of like expert environmental justice activist role here. I just want to hear from each of you how you got interested in environmental justice and whatever that means to you in particular.
And a hush fell over the Zoom.
I think you're muted, Amin.
Yeah, I just noticed that. Thank you. So for me, I would say that I've always advocated for the protection of the environment, and even, you know, that's why I pursued my career as an environmental scientist. On the flip side, though, I would say that I'm, in a way, ashamed to say that it wasn't until around 2016 when I began kind of more actively pursuing greater involvement with environmental justice through, particularly through, that's when I really got involved with PEJ, even though I'd kind of been on the fringes of PEJ since I was a graduate student back in the late 90s. But between that and then getting involved with a summer youth camp that's based in Southeast Raleigh called the Enviro Kids, those two experiences, or I don't know, it was just put on my heart that for something to kind of shift my perspective, because, you know, being trained as an environmental scientist, one of the participants, I can't remember who said it earlier, but we have this lens of, you know, the ecology and the animals and the you know, the environmental resources, and without necessarily incorporating the human dimensions of that. So I have, you know, since then, and then also getting to see something else that was really impactful for me is going to a conference a couple years ago in Minneapolis, Minnesota called the One Water Summit. And we went, they had a green infrastructure tour. We went around all different kind of locations throughout the city of Minneapolis. And I remember we were riding through this community and I was looking around and there was lots of green infrastructure. When I say green infrastructure, I mean trees, I mean a constructed wetland that addressed stormwater, and there were people of color in that community. So I was like, it was so beautiful to me. I was like, I would love to live here. I wouldn't mind living here. And then I found out that it was an affordable housing community, which just blew my mind, you know, to see kind of the possibilities of what can be when people think bigger and get out of the box of doing things a certain way and pigeonholing people into a certain way of life. So between that and then having an opportunity to go down to the Atlanta Watershed Learning Network's graduation ceremony back in September 2019, and to see folks from West Atlanta who've been, you know, historically underserved, disenfranchised, dealing with the development from downtown Atlanta and all of that, and to see a group of people who had been educated and empowered to really take a stand for their communities, to be able to advocate for things like green infrastructure and things that will help reduce stormwater and all those things. And it was you know, really inspired us to try and bring that work to Raleigh, and you know, we're going to be doing it hopefully early next year. So you know, so that's kind of how I've gotten involved over the years. And the more, that's why I said at the beginning, I'm still learning about this. And but it is, you know, no longer will I just look at you know, the environment without looking at you know, people, and especially me being an environmental scientist of color. There are not many of us out there. I could probably count on less than my two hands the amount of people of color that you know, do this. Even though, as Reverend Taylor said, that you know, we all are connected to the natural world in one way or another, whether we realize it or not.
I just quickly wanted to say, I mean, I'm really glad that you're represented here as a Black environmental science professional who is admitting that you just got involved in kind of the environmental justice component in 2016, because I've heard in the field, and I've been in this field for a while, there's this assumption sometimes that if you're Black and you're in the environmental field, that environmental justice is your jam, you know, because why wouldn't it be? It affects you guys, you know? And so I love for us to sort of challenge this narrative of what Black people in the environmental field look like, do, what perspectives we have, because that's also really important to broadening the conversation about who we are doing this work. Just wanted to say that.
Thanks, Stacia. Thank you.
I'll go next. I don't know whether I could really say that I am involved with the environmental or the partners for the environment. I can't say that that's really what I do. I live here. And one of the things that did get me involved was the cleaning up of the creek. There were cleanups that we've had through the years. And oh my goodness, the things that pulled out of it. And right now, you know, I could just cry every time I go, you know, past St. Ambrose on the corner there. There's always something down there, mattresses, televisions, this, that. And I wonder, you know, what people are thinking when they say to themselves, I know where we can get rid of this trash. And so it's almost like saying, that's what I feel about the community as well. And the people in that community, even if the people that do it look like me. You know, my thing is that they just don't know who they are. because if they knew who they were, they wouldn't be doing that. But there are others that come into the community and trash the community. So I've been on many clean sweeps through the years. And you know, just in my neighborhood or my block, just, you know, if I see things that are out of order, I will go and correct it. If I can move things or, you know, lift things or whatever. And I'm always calling my city council person about what, you know, what's going on. And they had a clothing box. I don't know if any of you remember, there was a clothing box on the corner of Garner Road and Bailey Drive, and it was just a mess all the time. People were bringing stuff, throwing stuff, and it was just a mess. And I complained about it. So, you know, eventually it was moved. And I was like, you know, that's, you know, you got to speak up. So, so I've gotten involved by speaking up on issues that I see going on in my community, and I'll get other people in the community to call as well. So, but in terms of doing this every day, as Amin and Tatiana probably do, that's not how I've gotten involved. I've gotten involved because I see something and I live here, and, you know, so I do. So that's my big concern, and I watch my community, because the community's because the community is gentrifying as it is. There are a lot of dogs that have come into the community, and they walk the dogs in the community, and they don't always clean up, because I've observed. But I've also have a solution. We'll talk about that another time.
Thank you for those words, Ms. Ajuba. And also, I want to uplift the importance of community members like you, who are the observers, who are the people who are staying active in calling their city representatives and holding them accountable. There's a lane and a role for everyone in this movement. And that's kind of why part of why I wanted to have this conversation with diverse perspectives, because I think there's a place for everyone. And when we get past this woke warrior culture of who's doing the most and who's the most activist-y of whatever, you know, I think that's when we can bring people into the conversation. So I applaud you and being an active community member, and that is a really important role in this movement.
Very true.
I'd say I got into environmental justice really from two streams. I have to credit my father for just love of earth. I grew up about an hour north of Raleigh in a rural area. He spent an incredible amount of time with me outside, whether walking nature trails in the woods, walking beside streams, going outside to see meteor showers, pointing out constellations, Cassia, Orion, Cassiopeia, Orion, all of these constellations, you know, stargazing, looking at the moon. And so I always had this love for the created order because my father loved it, and therefore I loved it and came to love it on my own. And then probably about the time I was in high school, perhaps middle school, Amin talked about the waste management facility in Warren County. My mother's from Warren County, and about the time they were trying to put that facility in a Black area in Warren County, probably 20 minutes from my home, there was also an effort afoot to put a dumping site, a trash dumping site, not far from where I lived. And so I saw community members organize and really prevented both of those facilities from coming to these Black areas. And then I just started paying attention. Looked at Katrina a little bit later, and saw Hurricane Katrina and the levees being broken, and looked at the history and saw that this was not the first time it happened. I look at Baltimore, at areas where Black people lived. It seemed like wherever Black people lived in mass, this is where environmental concern and neglect was. And so my being pulled into this movement comes from the love of the environment, really seeded in me by my father. And then also just looking around and seeing how Black and brown people have been treated like the environment. As I said earlier, placed in areas that were not really wanted by the majority culture. And St. Ambrose is the intersection of that, given that it is in a Black neighborhood and has a history of environmental racism. You know, we've been flooded by white supremacy, and the tide of white supremacy continues to flow over the levee of injustice.
Write that down.
Wow.
There's a poem in there, or maybe even a rap.
Yeah,
You heard it here first, folks.
We might as well just
And that's a wrap.
That's a rap.
Oh, wow. Sad but true. Sad
Yeah.
but true.
Yeah. Yeah.
How about you,
Going
Tatiana?
after you.
I know.
Why does this keep happening?
You got to jump in there, Tat. You got to
Jump
jump
out
in
there.
there.
I like to wait and gather my thoughts, but I need to stop ending up in this order.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't know. So now I'm all flustered. I commonly think about how I got interested in environment in general, and I really can't pinpoint it. Because so I'm from Chicago, and I hate to politicize this, but just being that it's a liberal area, a blue state, I was never growing up in a situation where there was people saying stuff like, oh, global warming doesn't exist. Now we say climate change. But at the time, like, nobody was ever in my schools trying not to talk about global warming. There was never any question about the validity of it. It was just you recycle. There was not a maybe you recycle, maybe you don't, maybe this is important, maybe it isn't. So like I never had this time where I just sort of became aware that these were important issues, because it was just always there. It was always ingrained. There was no question. The justice piece I did not learn about until really with the terminology until I was in college. And at that point I was just immediately incensed, because I was already passionate about environment. I was already passionate about social justice. So then when this issue comes to my attention that addresses both of those, I was like, wait, what? Where was I? I didn't know about any of this. I need to do something about this. This is a problem. And I just got incensed. And I also didn't really use this word activist to describe myself. I would say I didn't even use the word activist to describe myself until 2019. The word, I would say I was an advocate, because I think that's more of an educational, like I just want to share the information with people, and hopefully that will lead them to make changes. So I was kind of like, yeah, I'm not an activist, I'm an advocate. But people around me were kind of like, no, you're an activist, and let me tell you why. Because like the things that you do and the way that you like, no, this is activism. And so I'm like, okay, I think I kind of had to come to terms with that terminology, because I didn't see myself in that way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't know. I guess 2019 is when I admitted, I'm an activist. It was kind of like, I remember I was 18 years old, and somebody was like, this is kind of an aside, but somebody was like, oh, feminism. And I was like, I'm not a feminist. And they were like, well, is it important to you that women have equal rights? And I was like, well, yeah. They were like, well, then you're a feminist. And I'm like, oh, well, all right then. So it's like, it was kind of one of those moments again where somebody is like, stop trying to deny this. It is a thing. So yeah.
I love that you say that though, Tatiana, because I think, especially in today's world, with just social media culture and so many things being in sound bites, we can get lost in the sort of connotation of a word, or sort of the kind of values we think we heard were ascribed with a certain term, without breaking down like what it actually means, which is part of why I wanted to have this conversation. And that kind of segues just into, I'll share a little bit of my own introduction into environmental justice, which is I got really interested in environmental science in high school. I was a part of a club that did we did community service projects related to environmental things. So we did cleanups and recycling. And so, you know, I was sort of on the traditional environmental science advocacy path. But I've always been interested in community organizing and community service. And then, so when I got into school, I started out as a conservation biology major. And, you know, I think going into college, I had the perspective that, you know, well, Black people are marginalized in this field because we just haven't had access, we haven't had exposure to like seeing ourselves in the environmental field. And that's sort of why we're not represented here. And so my cause is going to be to sort of like, you know, pattern that we can be a part of this space, and that's important for us to be a part of, you know, environmental advocacy and environmental science and education. And then as I got deeper into school, my school was actually opening a school of sustainability. I got more interested in the social sciences than the physical sciences. And part of that because I was starting to see the through lines between how all these connections between injustices and inequities in community development, in economic systems. I got into Marxism, and I start connecting all these dots about like, okay, it's more than just society having a problematic relationship with environmental management and natural resource management. This is also, there's a human power systems hierarchy situation that's also integrated into the ways we think about the environment. And the fact that it's taken me up until this point to figure this out is problematic as a Black person who's been doing environmental work since high school. And that like activated me in a very radical way, because I was just like, it took me this long to figure this out. Like, this is very problematic. And I think for most of us who are in the, you know, environmental professional field proper, still see this sort of wrong relationship in terms of missing that whole element of why certain communities get the worst environmental context, and that it's not the opposite way around. Black communities don't create the pollution, we're situated in it because of injustices in our systems, right?
That's right.
And so with that, I want to segue into talking a little bit more specific to Raleigh. I really wanted to hear from each of you, what do you think some of the most challenging environmental justice issues in Raleigh are today, right now? I think all of us are connected in some way by that specific issue in one way or the other. And so I'd love to hear, specific to Raleigh, what you think some of the biggest environmental justice challenges are at the moment.
You're muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. There I go. Thank you all. I would say, just like in many areas across the United States and, you know, developing areas across the world, just the significant growth and development that's occurring in Raleigh and the Triangle area. We know that the more development you have, you know, the more stormwater runoff you're going to have. And it's, you know, that increased stormwater runoff is going to adversely impact those areas that are already flood prone and environmentally vulnerable, particularly along Walnut Creek. You know, there's a News and Observer article from 2017 that talked about how out of all the flood prone areas in the city of Raleigh, Walnut Creek essentially is the worst. And when I say the worst, you know, it has the worst flooding. You know, historically, Rochester Heights, where Juba lives, she's lived through Hurricane Fran and all of that. and now their areas downstream, their communities. Rose Lane is one, Dayshin Road is another that routinely gets flooded, even in events less than a hurricane. So I would say that, you know, the city of Raleigh has made efforts to address these issues, you know, but more, you know, continued grassroots advocacy is needed to kind of affect changes in city policy, in permitting, and even in the culture of the way that business is done, particularly as it relates to development, that will better, you know, hopefully better meet the needs of, you know, the more vulnerable, environmentally vulnerable and underserved communities in, within the city. So, and we hope that the initiatives, like what Ajuba does on a grassroots level, what Reverend Taylor does, and, you know, all of us on this call, we continue to do that. And I'm, you know, very excited. You know, the thing I'm most excited about with regards to this Raleigh Watershed Learning Network is help to empower the community members, to educate and empower them about these issues. And, you know, because, you know, they have a huge stake in it. They're the primary stakeholders in this effort. So I'm excited that hopefully you know, we hope that it will have that desired effect and impact, and it can be, you know, replicated in other areas as well. The second issue, just in my mind, in addition to the significant growth and development, is, you know, the rising property values that are kind of decreasing affordable housing options outside of the environmentally vulnerable areas in Southeast Raleigh and beyond. You know, so, you know, Mr. Juba mentioned you know, the gentrification, the involuntary displacement, however you want to call it, that's going on in Southeast Raleigh. You know, New York Times did an article about it. So it's happening in different ways, and you know, the adverse impact of that as well is that, you know, folks may be even more confined to search for livable spaces in the most environmentally vulnerable areas. So those are kind of the two challenging environmental justice issues that I see, although I'm sure there are plenty more.
I want to go, I'm not going after you. See, you was about to try to do it again. And plus, I think that 2 points that you made relate to two things that I think. So you talked about flooding being really bad and I just think that feeds into the notion of climate justice. And so marginalized communities, Black and brown folks who don't have very much money, having a longer and a harder time recovering from things like that is something that I think is important to keep in mind after you've experienced the flooding, your house floods and all that kind of stuff. Like if you're affluent, it might be easier and take less time to bounce back from that. You know, if you can't even afford the flood insurance or whatever, which if you don't always have to have flood insurance. If you have an active mortgage, you might, but if you're, you know, in a house that was passed down twice or whatever, and you don't have to carry that insurance and you don't, and you're flooded, then how can you, you know, deal with that? So I've you know, talked to families who dealt with those very issues. And so I think that is a piece that is important to consider. And then also as it relates to the affordable housing, another issue that relates to the affordable housing as well as to environmental justice is the concept of energy justice and people not only having access to a choice of what energy they have. Unfortunately, there's this kind of monopoly in North Carolina around energy. And so when prices go up, who is that impacting? Who can or cannot afford to deal with those rate hikes? And especially right now, as we're dealing with COVID-19 and people are dealing with not only housing that they might not be able to afford, but then also energy that they can't afford. And there's been conversations about what's going to happen once they resume the ability to disconnect people and people trying to catch up on past due bills. So I think, yeah, just both of those issues are very important right now and timely and connected to the issues that Amin brought up as it relates to flooding and affordable housing. All right, Rev.
You're funny. Jokes. Just wanted to pick up on Amin, what he said, to echo it. It's sad that from where I sit, what I call non-climate stressors are outpacing climate change. So from St. Ambrose's standpoint, it's not climate change that is impacting us in an extraordinarily negative way. It is non-climate stressors fueled by capitalist greed. The development or so-called progress in North Raleigh and in places north of us on Walnut Creek, the impervious soil, the impervious land that's impervious substance that's being put over land and with pavement. We sit in a 40 square mile watershed where conceivably every drop of rain that is not soaked into the ground runs right past my church. And I've been there 8 years. And with my eye, I can see the water line coming closer and closer to my church that sits in a floodplain. And so when we talk about environmental justice in Raleigh, we're really talking about, or at least from where I sit, non-climate stressors in buildings and development. And so the question becomes not so much how do we decrease our carbon footprint, but how do we build in such a way that we mitigate stormwater runoff? Because we mitigate stormwater runoff, I don't flood. And it's not my goal to have my congregation underwater, nor Sister Ajuba Joy's house, which is proximate to St. Ambrose, to have her place underwater. And so when I think about environmentalism in Raleigh, and from where I sit, is really non-climate stressors that is our biggest challenge.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add a little bit to what our Father Jamon has said. Talk about non-climate stressors. You know, there was a warning not too long ago, today actually, about a storm coming through. And immediately I get angst. Now, when Fran came through, that was considered the 100-year storm. And it took 6 homes, and none of those people are alive. Not because of the flooding, but it was just devastating, and they were elders in the community. And we're still being impacted by these possibilities. When I moved into this community, there was no issue of flood insurance. Now you have to have it if you're in this particular area. And I'm seeing some things going on with water that I hadn't seen before Fran. Before Fran, I hadn't seen these issues with water, but there's more standing water. We had a storm a few weeks ago, and when people came down the street, they weren't really sure about driving down Bailey Drive. I've never seen that before. Not with this little bit of water, little bit of rain that we had. So I'm not sure where this other additional water is coming from. The surfaces, I don't know, but it's there. And So there's a little angst for me as I look at it. And I was concerned about my neighbor who's completely blind, and his daughter is not well. And the warning was supposed to be till 10 o'clock. And then you hear the emergency, comes over your phone. They said it was going to be till 3 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't sleep real well. So there are things that are happening in this environment, and they're happening to people on a psychological level as well. So we have a lot of work to do, and there are things that can be done. Amin had talked about it many times in meetings about how you can make these water gardens, and just there's a lot of things that can be done, and I would like to see some of that, see some of the solutions. And we're also dealing with policy. It's like if you devalue the community, you devalue the people in the community, we'll deal with it eventually. And see, with Caucasians moving in to this community, people are going to be forced to do something, unfortunately. The house across the street from where I live, that's the only house on that side of the street, because 3 of those houses went with the flood in Fran, and then 2 on the other side of that house across the street went with Fran. So I don't know who they're talking to or what's being done or what's happening. But we really got to put our best minds together to really come up with workable and effective solutions. I don't know what will happen to this community if it continues being affected and bombarded by water.
I just want to read a text that I was texting one of my members who's in her mid-70s, and what Sister Ajuba mentioned made me think about this text. I'm just going to read, and it didn't just extract some names. It is criminal to once again subject individuals and families in sections of Southeast Raleigh to very toxic pollution. I do not understand engineering strategies. However, the issue runs very deep with me. Very close family friends, my aunt and uncle, experienced flooding from the stream in the back of their former home on Charles Street, just down from Darby, where they lived there years ago. Some believe that my aunt's death may have been partially attributed to mold and mildew from the dampness from the stream. I'm not sure if they understood the possible impact when they moved here. Concurrently, it is historically known that Black families often were unknowingly sold homes in areas with high toxicity. And when Sister Juba was sharing her story, I thought about the text with the church member, how her dear aunt died, as the family believes, from dampness due to mold and mildew in her home, just because it constantly flooded.
Yeah. The issues are deep, and I don't think that solutions are impossible. They're not impossible. It's just a matter of we valuing ourselves and our lives, and getting with people who have the knowledge to make those changes, such as Tatiana and Amin. I know they have my best interest at heart. So.
No doubt, Ajuba.
Beginning to rain. It's beginning to rain. Okay.
Yeah. And I'll just.
Go for it.
Go for it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Mr. Juba, that the more folks that in your community that you can make aware of this, or that'll be helpful too, because that's I think been the missing link with PEJ, honestly, for many years, is kind of the lack of connection to Rochester Heights, even though it was birthed in Rochester Heights. So whatever we can do to help get the word out about this, we'll come and talk. We'll do what we need to do. And last thing I'll say, I know we're getting late here, but our next meeting, Partners for Environmental Justice, on Wednesday, October 7th, we're actually going to have our community organizer, our environmental engineer, city council, or not city council, but a planning commission member with the city of Raleigh, and Devin, who was on the phone, talk about some of these issues as they relate to the proposed Downtown South project. So definitely tell as many people. It's probably going to be a Zoom meeting, but we're going to have a lot of the folks, our lead partners, speak about this, and the more people that hear it, the better.
As Amin said, I know I don't want to keep you guys too long, but I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity just to share any last thoughts you have about where you see the intersections of gentrification and environmental justice, either specific to Raleigh or just in general, if you have any last kind of thoughts or comments about that. Well, and I can start with one thing, because I just, there's one thing I don't remember. So much good stuff has been said during this conversation. But one point I just wanted to make is that I think a lot of people know about the history of redlining in America and sort of the racial injustices that happened in terms of home buying and lending, bank lending in America. But oftentimes what's missed in that history is a conversation about where Black communities were able to be situated. And what you see in a lot of American cities, again, with this environmental justice sort of injustice trajectory, is a lot of historically Black neighborhoods in America are situated in the most undesirable landscapes, and whatever that meant for that geography, right? So in a lot of cities in the South in particular, you'll see that historically Black neighborhoods that are now changing over with time have dealt with flooding issues, because historically this planning knew that those were floodplains, right? And so now we have a lot more regulations about where you can and can't develop in relationship to sort of floodplain areas. But in the past, we didn't have those regulations. And so now we're having to deal with that historical legacy of racial injustice in terms of where Black folks could or couldn't develop. And the question is, how do we right that wrong of injustice as development pressures continue in our cities, right?
Yeah, I'll say, we're advocate, what I think a way to do it is to advocate and insist on measures that are going to lessen the adverse impacts, environmental impacts, or social or public health impacts of a development. So that's kind of the route that we're taking with this project, and really advocating for above and beyond low impact development and green stormwater infrastructure, that is integrated into every aspect of this proposed development, as well as the equitable development elements that will bring benefits to Southeast Raleigh and not exacerbate the gentrification that's already been going on. Because Rochester Heights is less than a mile downstream from this proposed development, which I've been told is maybe one of the largest developments of that type ever within the history of the city. So just that we don't settle for the status quo, because I'll also tell you, my day job, I work for the North Carolina Division of Water Resources, and the stormwater, the existing stormwater regulations are not adequate for really what's needed with development. And it really just needs to be low impact development, and green stormwater infrastructure need to become the minimum baseline for how development is done.
Mm-hmm.
To respond to your question, Stacia, just want to tell a story and look at the lens of another historically Black Episcopal church, St. Philip's, founded in 1809, that is now in Harlem, New York. When that church was founded in 1809, it was on Center Street near Wall Street, the lower part of Manhattan, an area that was not desirous because it was flooding. But as Wall Street grew, Black people were displaced. And probably one of the most egregious stories is when they were building the federal building in 1991 near Center Street, they discovered, air quotes, the graves of 20,000 Black people under the federal building. But that's where Black people live. So St. Philip's Church was forced to move outside of the city up Manhattan to what became Central Park. And so if you go to Tavern on the Green, that's not far from where St. Philip's used to be. That was before it was Central Park. And then when Central Park was built, the church was forced to move farther up the island to where it currently resides in Harlem at 135th Street. And so when we look at gentrification and Black people and environmental neglect, what we see is that gentrification brings about the restoration of the neighborhood. That's what we saw in the story about St. Philip's in New York City. And so my fear of gentrification in Rochester Heights is that as the neighborhood flips, the flooding will stop, the infrastructure will come in, and the stories that Sister Juba told will no longer be told because the neighborhood will look different from how it did before. Black people will be displaced, and you have a new demographic with a higher tax base.
That's right.
And to get the attention of the city. And so that's my view of gentrification and the environmental effect. When certain people are impacted, what used to plague them no longer plagues an area.
Yeah. Yes, and just let me say very briefly, there's only one house over there that exists. And that's not owned by anyone who looks like any of us on this call. That one house. So that house is not going to flood. I mean, there may be some water around it, but it stayed. It functions, but also because of how it was situated, because the water came down Bailey Drive, which is at the side of this house. The other three houses on that same street got flooded, and the water came into their houses because it came west and came into their houses. And so I'm in agreement. It's like when they move into the communities, then all of a sudden the issues need to be addressed. We need to do something about this flooding, but we're on the case before that. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I every second everything that's already been said. And I think about this flip side of the scenario. So when even when there have been these issues that have happened in communities that have already had white folks just leave. There's a whole term, white flight, for when a community starts to have issues and they change. This happened with, so I'm from Chicago, but I went to high school in Gary, Indiana, and this is what happened in Gary, Indiana. And all the white folks left, and now it's over 85% Black, and you got the steel mill that's just pumping and has been pumping toxins into the community for decades. So it's just, I think what needs to happen is more, I would like to see more mixed income development. One of the things is that we always tend to have concentrated areas of low income folks, concentrated poverty. And it's very obvious, like anytime I do a lot of traveling, anytime I go into a city, I know exactly where the public housing is because it looks like public housing. You go and I'm like, yep, there goes the public housing. I was with a friend and I was saying this and he's like, I have a planner's eye. He doesn't have a planner's eye. He doesn't know about this. And I'm like, there it goes right there. This is a city I've never been to before. I'm like, that is a public housing development right there. We need to have less of that because if we don't develop like that in the first place, where we have these concentrated areas of poverty, then I think there's less likelihood of these sort of issues even happening in the first place. You can't target a community if it's more integrated instead of concentrating marginalized people in one area. And it's not so easy to spot. We need to really address that issue. And I think that'll help with the gentrification too, because everybody is kind of already going to be inherently mixed in together. But right now, I think since that isn't an issue, unfortunately too, sometimes there's been this terminology about green gentrification as well, when you try to fix environmental issues in communities or do more eco-friendly development, and then the folks who are already there getting pushed out. So I think too, just working on projects in such a way, like it's already been said, that you're thinking about equity and equitable development as you're developing, so that we don't have those issues. It's really, these are side effects. They're side effects of just the way that we develop communities. And we really have to stop with this. We've been doing this for too long, developing in this harmful way that targets certain groups and not others. And we really need to address that first, and hopefully make it so that it's a norm that hopefully we won't have to hopefully one day we don't have to call it equitable development, because it's just development. It's just the way that things are done, so that it's not this special thing that's happening in certain communities, but just the way that things are done across the board, so that you don't end up with environmental injustice in certain communities. You don't end up with gentrification because you're not making space for those issues to arise in the first place.
Wow, that was a beautiful way to sort of round out this conversation. I'm glad somebody with your level of planning expertise sort of, kind of brought us to the close of this conversation, because we can't talk about urban conservation and sustainable development, any of these kind of words that are used in terms of talking about the greening of America's cities in a just way, unless we talk about affordable housing, right? And income equality. All of those things have to be in conversation together in terms of how we're approaching development. So thank you for that, Tatiana. And thank all of you for sort of being so present in your energy and bringing your perspective to this conversation. I will say one silver lining of the current circumstances that I think we're in right now is that as we're sheltering in place more in our homes, hopefully we're all kind of being forced to think about the quality of our environment and what matters to us and sort of what we can do internally and externally. And I'm glad to have more time and space in my work to have conversations like this, because this is these are the conversations that fuel me. And even though we talked about a lot of heavy stuff, the perspectives and the hopefulness that you all shared gives me hope. So thank you for all of that. Well, I appreciate all of your time and effort, and appreciate all the perspectives that were brought up in this conversation. Thank you, guys.
And thank you, Stasia, for inviting us, and for your sincerity and your stick-to-itiveness. I really
Persistent
appreciate that.
is one thing that
That's right.
I absolutely
Your
am.
persistence, yes.
Amen
Thank
to
you
that.
for that.